She sits alone at a metal table, hands folded neatly in front of her. The room is quiet, almost ordinary. Beige walls. A clock ticking somewhere out of frame. Nothing about this moment suggests history is about to split in two. For years, everyone agreed on who she was. A devoted mother, attentive, protective, the kind of person neighbors trusted without question, the kind teachers smiled at during parent meetings, the kind strangers defended instinctively because the idea of her doing harm felt impossible. That certainty followed her into this room. When investigators first spoke to her, they spoke gently. They used her first name. They offered water. They asked about her child before asking about the incident. And she answered the way someone innocent would answer. Calm, measured, cooperative. If you were watching then, you might have felt reassured. You might have thought this would be routine, a formality before the truth naturally revealed itself. But interrogations do not reveal truth all at once. They reveal pressure. They reveal structure. They reveal what remains consistent and what cannot survive scrutiny. Before I go any further, I want you to think about this and tell me in the comments as you listen. If someone in authority labeled you as a threat today, would you believe you'd get a fair chance to explain yourself? Or would you already know how the story ends? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. Please don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay close. This room has seen many people sit in that same chair. Some tell the truth immediately. Some resist. Some believe they can shape the outcome with the right words. What makes this case different is not volume, or emotion, or spectacle. It is how slowly certainty erodes. Minute by minute, her story is tested, not through accusation, but through repetition. The same events, revisited from different angles. The same timeline, asked again with the order slightly rearranged. At first, the changes are small. A time adjusted by minutes. A detail clarified. Nothing that would alarm an untrained ear. But investigators are trained to listen for patterns, not excuses. They notice when answers grow longer instead of clearer. They notice when confidence appears only in certain places. They notice when emotion arrives at convenient moments and disappears just as quickly. Still, nothing is said outright. No raised voices. No slammed fists. No declarations of guilt. Just questions. And patience. Because an interrogation is not about forcing a confession. It is about allowing a story to collapse under its own weight. Outside this room, a community waits, still holding on to the version of her they recognize. A mother who would never. A woman who could not. Inside, something else is happening. Not a transformation. A revelation. What unfolds here will not rely on assumptions or appearances. It will rely on what can be supported, what can be tested, and what cannot remain intact once evidence enters the conversation. By the time this interrogation ends, the question will no longer be whether she is believed. It will be whether the story she told was ever possible at all. This is not a story about shock. It is a story about process, about how certainty gives way to contradiction, and how a single room can change the direction of an entire case. Before investigators asked a single formal question, they already knew how she was seen. In public records, she appeared ordinary. No criminal history. No prior investigations. Nothing that would draw attention on its own. To neighbors, she was attentive. To school staff, involved. To friends and relatives, present. The image was reinforced repeatedly through social interactions, family routines, and the quiet credibility that comes from consistency over time. This mattered more than most people realize. Because when investigators assess a case, they do not begin from suspicion alone. They begin from context. And in this context, the role she occupied carried weight. A parent is assumed to protect. A caregiver is assumed to prioritize safety. These assumptions are not emotional, they are statistical. They reflect patterns observed across thousands of cases. Cases like this rarely announce themselves as important at the beginning. At first, they look familiar. A call placed to authorities. An explanation offered quickly. A person at the center who fits comfortably into a role everyone already understands. There is a tendency in moments like these to let recognition stand in for verification, to allow identity to guide interpretation, to accept a story not because it has been tested, but because it aligns with what feels reasonable. In this case, the reasonableness was powerful. She was known as a mother first. That detail alone shaped every early assumption. It influenced how questions were asked, how answers were heard, and how long doubt was delayed. This is not unusual. It is human. Investigators, like anyone else, operate within frameworks formed by experience. And experience teaches that most parents do not harm their children, that most caregivers act in protection, not opposition. So when she spoke, her words carried weight. When she described events, they were initially treated as clarification, not construction. When emotions appeared, they were interpreted through the lens of concern rather than calculation. But investigations are not meant to rest on familiarity. They are meant to endure repetition. They are meant to withstand pressure. They are meant to remain intact when details are rearranged, revisited, and examined without context. This is where interrogations matter. An interrogation is not simply a conversation held behind closed doors. It is a controlled environment designed to test consistency over time, to separate recollection from reconstruction, to observe not just what is said, but how it changes when revisited. In this room, statements are no longer protected by first impressions. They are measured against evidence, against sequence, against physics, timing, and plausibility. What makes this case significant is not the presence of an interrogation, but its outcome. Because prior to entering that room, there was no unified suspicion, no public outrage, no singular theory that demanded urgency. There was only a story that seemed sufficient. To understand why this interrogation mattered, investigators first had to understand who she was believed to be. Not in theory, not in rumor, but on paper. Official records told a quiet story. She lived a life that left little trace beyond what was required. Housing records showed stability. Employment files reflected consistency rather than ambition. Nothing suggested volatility. Nothing suggested disruption. She was part of a household that followed a recognizable structure. Family members described routines. Meals at predictable times. School drop-offs. Appointments kept. Responsibilities met. In interviews conducted later, neighbors struggled to recall anything unusual at all. That absence became its own kind of testimony. People remembered her because she blended easily into the background of everyday life. She waved when passing. She attended school-related events when expected. She spoke about her child with the same language most parents use: concern, pride, fatigue. Teachers recalled her as engaged, but not intrusive. Social workers, when contacted during the investigation, found no prior reports that raised alarms. Medical and school documentation reflected a child who appeared cared for, monitored, and accounted for. The record, as it existed before the investigation, did not argue against her. It supported her. This is how the narrative formed, not through exaggeration, but through accumulation. A series of small confirmations reinforced each other. Each normal interaction added weight to the idea that she was exactly who she appeared to be. When friends were interviewed, they spoke carefully. Many emphasized her dedication. Some mentioned stress, but stress without conflict. The kind spoken of casually, as a universal feature of parenthood. No one described fear. No one described instability. No one described concern that demanded documentation. And this matters. Because investigations do not unfold in a vacuum. They begin within the boundaries of what is already believed. The role of mother is not just a descriptor. It is a framework. It shapes how behavior is interpreted. It influences which questions feel necessary and which feel inappropriate. It determines how long doubt remains unspoken. When authorities reviewed her background, They did not find a pattern pointing toward harm. They found a pattern that pointed away from it. There were no prior arrests, no history of domestic calls tied to her name, no documented incidents that suggested danger. Even her digital footprint offered little disruption. Social media posts, where available, showed ordinary snapshots, celebrations, milestones, images that aligned with the public version of her life. Nothing overt, nothing alarming, nothing that demanded reinterpretation at the time. This consistency created something powerful: insulation. It meant that when questions first arose, they arose softly. They were framed as clarification rather than challenge, as understanding rather than examination. Because to question her too sharply would require questioning the entire structure that supported her image. And that structure was reinforced not just by perception, but by documentation. It is important to say this clearly. At this stage, there was no confirmed evidence that contradicted the narrative. That absence is not an oversight. It is a condition, one that allowed the investigation to move slowly, one that allowed trust to persist longer than it otherwise might have. This is where many cases rest. They pause here, balanced between assumption and inquiry, never advancing far enough to expose what lies beneath. But this case did not pause. Because while background establishes credibility, it does not replace verification. And while appearances may delay scrutiny, they do not eliminate it. At a certain point, investigators stopped asking who she was supposed to be, and began asking whether the story being told could survive being examined again, carefully, methodically, and without the protection of familiarity. That shift did not happen publicly. It did not happen dramatically. It happened quietly, through records laid side by side, through timelines compared rather than accepted, through statements revisited not for meaning, but for structure, and eventually, through the decision to bring her into a room where the past could no longer rely on reputation alone. Everything up to this point had built the foundation. What follows will test it. The event that brought authorities into her life did not arrive with chaos. It arrived quietly. According to records, the timeline begins with an ordinary morning. No alerts, no warnings, no indication that anything had already gone wrong. At a documented time, a call was placed. The details of that call were brief, measured, focused on outcome rather than explanation. Emergency services were dispatched based on the information provided. First responders arrived to a scene that appeared controlled. There was no immediate disorder, no visible signs of struggle noted at entry. What they encountered instead was stillness. A child was present, unresponsive. Medical personnel followed protocol. Vital signs were assessed. Interventions were attempted. Time was recorded carefully. The response unfolded according to training, not urgency driven by panic. The environment did not suggest haste. It suggested delay. Law enforcement was notified as procedure required. Officers arrived while medical efforts were ongoing. Initial observations were logged. At this stage, there was no crime scene. There was only an outcome that needed explanation. The first account of events came quickly. She described a sequence that, on its surface, aligned with possibility. An accident, a sudden realization, an attempt to respond. Her explanation did not conflict directly with what responders could immediately observe. There were no obvious signs demanding contradiction. As a result, early assumptions formed naturally. Investigators initially approached the case as a tragic incident, a loss that required documentation rather than suspicion, a situation where the role of law enforcement was secondary to confirmation. This approach shaped everything that followed. The scene was not secured with urgency beyond standard procedure. Interactions remained courteous. Questions were framed to clarify rather than challenge. But timelines, once written down, invite comparison. As officers began logging precise times, arrival, response, actions taken, small gaps emerged. Not enough to alarm. Enough to note. The duration between the reported discovery and the emergency call raised questions. The explanation offered was brief. It accounted for shock, for hesitation. These are not unusual factors, but they remain factors. Medical examiners later documented findings that required alignment with the timeline provided. Certain physiological markers indicated estimates that were broad, not definitive. That uncertainty created space. Space for interpretation. Space for review. As investigators reviewed the sequence again, they noticed how little variation existed in her account. Each retelling followed the same structure, the same order, the same phrasing. Consistency is often read as reliability, but investigators are trained to recognize when consistency becomes rigidity. At this early stage, they did not challenge it. They recorded it. There were also details that remained absent. Not missing, simply unaddressed. Certain actions that would be expected in an emergency were not described. Certain observations were omitted without explanation. No conclusion was drawn from this. Only notation. The scene itself offered limited assistance. Environmental factors did not clearly support or contradict the account given. Nothing appeared out of place. Nothing immediately demanded reinterpretation. And yet, as documentation accumulated, questions multiplied quietly. Why certain actions occurred in the order described? Why certain details were remembered with clarity while others were generalized? Why some moments were emphasized and others passed over entirely? None of this constituted evidence of wrongdoing, but it did alter the direction of the investigation. What began as record-keeping shifted toward verification. Investigators requested additional statements, not because they suspected deception, but because the outcome demanded certainty. Medical findings required context. Timelines required precision. And explanations required repetition. It was at this point that the decision was made to move beyond informal questioning, not because a conclusion had been reached, but because it had not. The absence of clarity became the central issue. And when clarity does not emerge on its own, it must be tested. That test would not occur at the scene. It would not occur in passing conversation. It would occur in a controlled setting, where time could be slowed and sequences could be examined without interruption. The incident itself had ended. What followed was an examination of how it had been described, and whether that description could remain intact when nothing was assumed. In the days that followed the incident, the investigation moved forward without urgency. This was not an oversight. It was procedure. Cases involving sudden loss inside a family environment often begin with restraint. Investigators are trained to avoid conclusions until medical findings are reviewed and timelines are verified. And in this case, the person at the center of the event did not resist that process. She remained available. She answered calls. She responded to requests without hesitation. When officers returned to follow up, they were greeted calmly. There was no refusal, no visible concern about scrutiny. Her cooperation reinforced what many already believed. During initial interviews, she maintained the same account given on the day of the incident. Details aligned in structure, even when phrasing varied slightly. Investigators documented her responses carefully. They noted the consistency. They also noted the absence of escalation. There were no attempts to redirect blame. No expressions of hostility toward authorities. No signs of fear related to questioning itself. This further delayed suspicion, because individuals attempting to conceal wrongdoing often display one of two patterns: avoidance or overreaction. She displayed neither. Instead, she appeared settled into the process. When asked about the sequence of events, she answered without visible strain. When asked to clarify timing, she did not object. When asked to repeat details, she did so with minimal variation. Officers described her demeanor as composed. That description appeared repeatedly in reports. Composed, controlled, present. This mattered, because emotional volatility is often what draws attention first. Its absence can be interpreted as stability rather than restraint. At this stage, investigators continued to view the case through the lens of misfortune. The working theory remained unchanged. The loss was still understood as an incident requiring explanation, not accusation. Medical examiners continued their review. Toxicology, injury assessment, and physiological indicators were analyzed according to standard timelines. These findings did not immediately contradict the narrative provided, but they did not fully support it either. Certain markers suggested a broader window than expected. Certain responses did not align cleanly with the sequence described. Again, none of this demanded confrontation. It required patience. Investigators began reconstructing the day in segments, not to disprove the account, but to understand it. They mapped movements. They logged time intervals. They compared what was said with what could be confirmed. As this process unfolded, small adjustments began to appear in her statements. Not contradictions, clarifications. She refined timing slightly. She expanded on actions previously summarized. She explained omissions as oversight rather than intent. Each adjustment was documented. Individually, these changes meant little. Collectively, they created complexity. And complexity, in investigations, invites closer attention. Still, no immediate shift occurred. There were no accusations. No change in tone during interviews. No indication that she was being reevaluated as a suspect. Institutional caution prevailed. The role she occupied continued to influence interpretation. A parent grieving a loss is expected to struggle with recall. Memory fragmentation is not unusual in such circumstances. Investigators accounted for this. They consulted specialists. They reviewed comparable cases. Nothing, at this point, justified a departure from measured procedure. And yet, the case did not settle. The more documentation accumulated, the more effort was required to maintain coherence. Questions that had been peripheral began to return. Why certain actions occurred in the order described. Why specific moments were described in detail while others remained vague. Why emotional responses appeared consistent in some settings and absent in others. These questions remained internal. They were discussed among investigators, not with her. Because once suspicion is expressed, it alters everything. And investigators understood that if they crossed that threshold, they could not return. The decision to delay confrontation was deliberate. They chose instead to observe, to listen, to allow repetition to reveal structure. At this stage, the case existed in a state of balance, between trust and verification, between assumption and examination. It was still possible that nothing criminal had occurred. It was still possible that the inconsistencies would resolve. But it was no longer possible to proceed without testing the account under controlled conditions. That realization did not arrive with certainty. It arrived with restraint. And from that restraint came the decision that would change the direction of the investigation. A formal interrogation. Not because guilt had been established, but because uncertainty had not been resolved. The decision to bring her in was documented carefully. It was not framed as an escalation. It was framed as clarification. Investigators contacted her with a request rather than a demand. The language used was deliberate. They explained that additional details were needed to complete the record. They emphasized cooperation, not confrontation. She agreed. On the scheduled day, she arrived without hesitation. There was no delay, no visible reluctance. Her arrival was logged. The time was recorded. The location was standard, an interview suite designed for extended questioning. The room itself offered nothing that would draw attention. A table, chairs, neutral walls, recording equipment positioned openly, not concealed. This was intentional. Transparency at this stage served a purpose. It reduced defensiveness. It reinforced the idea that this was still an information-gathering exercise. Before questioning began, protocol was followed. Her rights were read aloud. She acknowledged understanding. Consent to proceed was documented. These steps were routine, but their impact was not. From this point forward, every statement would carry a different weight. The structure of the interrogation was planned in advance. Investigators did not begin with the incident itself. They began with neutral ground, background questions, daily routines, unrelated details that established baseline behavior. This phase served multiple functions. It allowed investigators to observe her communication style. It established patterns in how she recalled information. It provided reference points for later comparison. She answered without hesitation. Her tone remained even, her posture unchanged. When asked to describe her typical day, she spoke in sequence. When asked about responsibilities, she listed them without pause. Nothing about these early moments suggested strain. Investigators noted this. They were not looking for emotion. They were looking for structure. Once baseline questioning concluded, the focus shifted gradually. The incident was introduced without emphasis, not as an event to be challenged, but as one to be revisited. She was asked to describe it again, not from the beginning, from the middle. This was deliberate. By altering the entry point, investigators could observe how she reconstructed the sequence. She complied. Her description followed a familiar path. The same order, the same landmarks. Investigators did not interrupt. They allowed her to complete the account fully. Then they asked again, this time from the end. Again, she answered. Certain details remained constant. Others required adjustment. These adjustments were subtle. A pause before answering. A clarification added. A moment revisited with additional explanation. None of this was challenged. The strategy at this stage was not exposure. It was accumulation. Investigators recorded the differences without comment. They moved slowly, returning to earlier points after discussing unrelated topics. This created distance between repetitions. Memory recalled under distance reveals more than memory recalled under pressure. Throughout this process, her demeanor remained controlled. There was no visible agitation, no visible confusion. This consistency, however, began to raise its own questions. Because the room was designed to test endurance. Interrogations extend not to exhaust, but to observe what changes over time. As minutes passed, investigators introduced specificity, exact times, exact locations, exact sequences. When answers required precision, her responses narrowed. She became careful with phrasing. She qualified statements that had previously been broad. Again, nothing overt. But the room does not require overt signals. It requires deviation. Investigators then introduced documentation, not evidence, records, phone logs, timestamps, medical response times. These were presented not as contradictions, but as anchors. She was asked to place her account alongside them. Her responses adjusted again. She explained the differences. She accounted for delays. She filled gaps with reasoning. Each explanation was noted. Still no accusation. The room remained quiet. The tone remained respectful. This was not an attempt to force admission. It was an attempt to observe how a narrative behaves under structure. As the session continued, investigators shifted roles. One asked questions. Another observed. The observer noted posture, hand movement, changes in speech rhythm. These observations were documented separately, not to diagnose, to compare. Eventually, the repetition reached a point where the narrative could no longer remain untouched. Not because it was false, but because it was being tested. This is where interrogations diverge from interviews. An interview collects information. An interrogation evaluates it. The difference is not volume or aggression. It is intent. By the time the questioning paused, hours had passed. She was offered a break, water, time to rest. She accepted. The recording did not stop. Because sometimes what happens between questions matters as much as the answers themselves. When the session resumed, the tone did not change, but the direction did. Investigators began returning to moments she had already explained. They asked why certain details were remembered clearly while others were not. They asked how she accounted for specific intervals. These were not challenges. They were requests for clarity. The room remained quiet, but the purpose of the room had shifted. It was no longer there to document her story. It was there to determine whether that story could remain whole. When investigators returned to the statements, they did not look for deception. They looked for structure. Every account given up to this point was placed side by side, not to measure truthfulness, but to measure stability. The first pass focused on language. Words chosen early in the process were compared with those used later. Certain phrases appeared repeatedly, unchanged across retellings. Others shifted subtly, replaced with qualifiers or softened explanations. This was not immediately significant. Language adapts. Memory adjusts. But when investigators mapped these changes against time, patterns began to appear. Descriptions of actions taken remained consistent. Descriptions of timing did not. In earlier statements, intervals were summarized broadly. Later, as precision was requested, those intervals expanded. Minutes became ranges. Sequences required clarification. This adjustment did not occur all at once. It emerged incrementally. Investigators noted when specificity was volunteered and when it had to be requested. They observed which moments were described confidently and which were approached carefully. Particular attention was paid to transitions, the moments between actions, the spaces between events. In those spaces, explanations became less concrete. When asked to account for these intervals, she did not refuse. She responded with reasoning rather than recollection. This distinction mattered. Recollection is anchored in sensory detail. Reasoning is constructed after the fact. Investigators documented where this shift occurred. They also reviewed how her emotional responses aligned with content. When discussing routine matters, her tone remained even. When discussing outcomes, it remained composed. But when discussing timing, her cadence changed. Sentences slowed. Pauses lengthened. This was not attributed to guilt. It was attributed to cognitive effort. The question became why that effort was required in specific areas and not others. Investigators then returned to earlier statements made before formal questioning began. Informal remarks given to responders were transcribed and reviewed. These early comments were less structured, less deliberate. They contained details that did not appear later. Not contradictions, but omissions. Investigators flagged these points. They did not assume intent. They noted sequence. As statements progressed through formal settings, certain elements disappeared. Other elements became more refined. This refinement raised questions. Because genuine memory degradation typically results in loss, not replacement. What investigators observed was not loss, but substitution. Generalizations replaced specifics. Explanations replaced descriptions. Again, no conclusions were drawn. The analysis continued. Behavioral observations were then layered onto statement review. Posture during early questioning was compared with posture during later sessions. Hand movement frequency was measured. Eye contact duration was logged, not interpreted, simply recorded. Patterns emerged here as well. During neutral discussion, her movements were minimal. During detailed reconstruction, they increased. Not dramatically, just enough to be noted. Investigators also observed how she responded to silence. When a question was followed by immediate engagement, she continued speaking. When a question was followed by silence, she filled it. This tendency intensified as questioning progressed. Silence functions as a mirror in interrogations. What a subject chooses to place into that space matters. Investigators did not interrupt these moments. They allowed her to continue. What emerged was not a confession. It was elaboration. She provided additional context without being asked. She clarified points that had not been challenged. This suggested awareness of scrutiny. Not panic, but recognition. As the session continued, investigators revisited the same sequence multiple times. They altered order. They altered phrasing. They asked about consequences before causes. They asked about causes without naming outcomes. Each variation tested the same foundation. Certain elements held. Others shifted. By the end of this phase, investigators had not proven anything. But they had learned something essential. The narrative was not collapsing. It was compensating. Each time pressure was applied, it adjusted to maintain coherence. This adaptability was noted, not as evidence, but as behavior. Investigators concluded this phase without confrontation. They ended the session without accusation, without escalation. She was informed that further review would continue. She acknowledged this calmly. As she left the room, nothing outward had changed. But the investigation had. Because from this point forward, the focus was no longer on what had happened. It was on how the account responded to being examined, and whether continued examination would eventually expose limits that explanation alone could not resolve. By the time investigators reached this stage, the groundwork had been laid. Hours of statements, repeated questioning, and observation of behavior had produced a detailed map of what had been said, how it had been said, and what remained unexplained. Now, the process shifted. The next step was not about asking questions in the abstract. It was about introducing information that existed independently of the narrative she had constructed. Documents, logs, records, everything that could corroborate or contradict. Her account was brought into the room. The presentation was deliberate, not confrontational in tone, but precise, not accusatory, but methodical. Each piece of evidence was placed clearly on the table, visible to all present. No hidden materials, no surprises intended for shock. The first items were mundane: phone records, timestamps, routine documentation of movements. At first, she responded without hesitation. She explained each entry calmly. She aligned her story with the logs, providing context for minor variations. Investigators listened quietly. They took notes. They recorded responses verbatim. Nothing about the scene demanded immediate intervention. Yet, as the evidence accumulated, small inconsistencies began to appear. Not contradictions in the dramatic sense, but moments where explanation could not fully reconcile observation. For example, an interval between her stated actions and recorded times on official logs differed by minutes. Minutes that, under normal circumstances, might pass unnoticed. Minutes that, in aggregation, raised questions about the sequence she had provided. She accounted for them logically, offering clarifications that were plausible. Investigators noted each clarification. They did not dismiss them, nor did they accept them blindly. Each was logged and compared against prior statements. Next came medical documentation. These records were precise, objective, and independent. They outlined timing, physiological indicators, and procedural steps taken by first responders. Investigators asked her to walk through each point, describing what she did, what she observed, and why actions were taken in that order. Her responses followed familiar patterns. Clarity in some areas, generalization in others. What had once seemed stable now required careful attention. Investigators began layering the records against one another. Time of call versus time of arrival. Arrival versus first medical intervention. Observed responses versus described responses. At this stage, the room grew quieter. No voices were raised. No expressions betrayed emotion. The tension emerged through the comparison of fact with account. Each record was neutral. Each account was her own. Where they diverged, she offered reasoning. Where reasoning aligned, it was documented. Investigators then returned to her earlier statements. They read them aloud, line by line, asking her to confirm or clarify. This repetition was different from the initial questioning. It was not about recollection alone. It was about coherence. She adjusted details when prompted. She rephrased explanations. She accounted for discrepancies with logic, not emotion. This process revealed a subtle shift. Behavior that had been entirely composed now showed moments of tension. Pauses lengthened slightly when records contradicted memory. Gestures, minimal until now, appeared more deliberate. Still, there was no outburst. No admission. No dramatic collapse. Investigators continued with structure. They asked about intervals, placing actions in precise order. They asked about decisions, focusing on reasoning rather than motive. They asked about observations, ensuring that recollection aligned with independently verifiable facts. Each interaction built a cumulative record, a series of data points rather than a narrative. And with each point, the room's atmosphere changed, not through expression, but through realization. For the first time, it became clear that her narrative, while largely consistent, required adaptation to align with documented evidence. Adaptation is not inherently proof of intent, but it does reveal something. It reveals how a story responds under pressure. It reveals the boundaries of explanation. It reveals the moments when reasoning must fill gaps that memory cannot. Investigators then introduced overlapping evidence. Multiple sources were compared simultaneously. Phone logs alongside movement timelines. Medical intervention timing alongside her statements. Witness statements alongside her narrative. Each comparison required her to reconcile information. Each reconciliation demanded cognitive effort. She complied. No defiance. No confrontation. Each time a gap was noted, she accounted for it. Each time a sequence conflicted, she reasoned through it. The observers in the room documented every adjustment. Because every adjustment is data. By the end of this phase, investigators had not forced admission. They had not accused. They had not declared guilt. What they had done was systematic. They had subjected a narrative to the scrutiny of independent evidence. They had tested its stability. They had noted where reasoning replaced recall. They had observed where alignment required conscious effort. This phase concluded without spectacle, yet its significance was unmistakable. The narrative that had seemed absolute was now demonstrably responsive. It bent to align with the records rather than existing independently. In a sense, the story had been revealed as both durable and adaptable. Durable because much of it held across scrutiny. Adaptable because adjustments had been necessary to reconcile with objective facts. The room remained calm, but beneath the surface, the foundation of certainty had shifted. And it was here that investigators understood the direction the case would take. Not through confrontation, but through accumulation. Not through spectacle, but through structured comparison. What emerged from this phase would guide every subsequent action, every follow-up question, every interpretation, every step toward eventual resolution. Because in controlled observation, even small discrepancies matter. Even subtle adjustments carry weight. Even the calmest demeanor cannot shield a story from the structure imposed by evidence. And from that realization, the investigation moved forward, toward the moments where adaptation would no longer suffice, toward the moments where explanation alone would meet the limits of plausibility. What investigators had observed in the interrogation room could be described, first and foremost, as behavior under scrutiny. Hours of questioning, repetition of statements, and exposure to independent evidence had created conditions that are standard in investigative procedure, but extraordinary in their effect. Psychologists who consult on these cases often emphasize a single principle. Under pressure, the mind does not always operate in linear fashion. It does not always prioritize narrative over cognition. It prioritizes consistency, coherence, and the avoidance of contradiction. In this room, these principles were visible. When questioned about sequences of actions, she often paused, not out of hesitation born of guilt, but as a cognitive response to complexity. Pauses lengthened when independent records required reconciliation. Explanations were modified incrementally, sometimes in phrasing, sometimes in timing. Small adjustments emerged, subtle enough that a casual observer might not notice. Investigators documented these behaviors meticulously. Eye contact, posture, hand movements, verbal cadence, all became points of observation. Patterns were logged, not interpreted for emotion, but analyzed for consistency and adaptability. Behavioral experts later noted that such shifts are often indicative of high cognitive load rather than malice or deception. When faced with repeated scrutiny, the brain works to reconcile memory with new information. Memory, unlike fact, is reconstructive. Each repetition can introduce modifications, even when intent is neutral. What made this case significant was the interplay between these behavioral adjustments and the narrative itself. Her narrative remained largely intact. Actions, decisions, and key details were consistent. Yet reasoning and explanation were required in places where direct recollection could not provide clarity. She demonstrated the ability to fill gaps deliberately, to align her story with a documented sequence, and to maintain composure throughout hours of questioning. This composure is not proof of innocence, nor is it proof of culpability. It is a behavioral marker. It is a window into how humans respond when their narrative is placed under structured evaluation. Investigators and expert consultants observed several specific patterns. Adaptive consistency. The narrative adjusted minimally to align with new information while preserving core elements. This suggests active cognitive processing rather than fabrication for dramatic effect. Controlled emotional expression. While minor fluctuations in tone and cadence occurred, overt emotional outbursts were absent. This indicates awareness of the environment and an attempt to regulate behavior under stress. Gap reconciliation. Instances where memory gaps were filled with reasoning rather than observation were noted repeatedly. This is consistent with standard cognitive function under repeated questioning. Response to independent evidence. When confronted with phone logs, timestamps, and medical documentation, explanations were modified without visible distress, indicating analytical engagement rather than avoidance. Experts reviewing this interrogation later emphasized that such behavioral responses are common in high-pressure, truth-testing environments. They are not necessarily predictive of criminality, nor are they definitive evidence of innocence. They are, however, highly informative to investigators. This phase of the process illuminated a critical principle in forensic psychology. Behavior under scrutiny is as important as statements themselves. How a story survives or adapts reveals not only cognitive mechanisms, but also the potential boundaries of credibility. For the investigators, these observations informed every next step. They indicated where questions could be refined, where further documentation might be required, where inconsistencies, though subtle, could be clarified. And they illuminated another factor: the human capacity for narrative preservation. Even under hours of controlled interrogation, even under repeated review against independent evidence, the mind seeks to maintain coherence. It does not surrender easily. From a procedural standpoint, the interrogation had accomplished its goal. It had exposed the points where memory relied on reconstruction, where reasoning supplemented recall, and where the narrative had to be actively aligned with records. From a narrative standpoint, it had also accomplished something else. It had demonstrated the fragility and resilience of perception. Outside the room, she remained the mother everyone knew. Inside, her account had been tested against objective measures, minute by minute, question by question. The story she had told was no longer a matter of assumption. It was now subject to evidence, observation, and professional interpretation. The behavioral phase concluded without declaration, without judgment, and without spectacle. It was a quiet demonstration of how structure, time, and independent documentation intersect to reveal truths that appearances alone cannot convey. And as the interrogation progressed toward its final stages, the investigators prepared to confront the points where alignment with evidence would demand the clearest explanations, where reasoning could no longer suffice, and where the narrative's limits would be revealed not through emotion, but through precision. After hours in the controlled environment of the interrogation room, the session reached its formal conclusion. By this point, investigators had amassed a comprehensive record. Statements given repeatedly, clarifications, subtle adjustments, and responses to independent documentation. Every detail had been logged, every pause observed, every clarification noted. The purpose of the session had been methodical, not confrontational. It had not sought a dramatic confession, nor had it demanded an immediate declaration. It sought coherence, verification of narrative against objective evidence, and the room had delivered precisely that. Once the interrogation concluded, investigators reviewed the entirety of the collected material. This review extended beyond a single session. Prior statements, field notes, emergency response logs, medical documentation, and witness accounts were all placed in sequence. The goal was to identify patterns, consistencies, and inconsistencies with clarity. The result of this review guided the next step, formal charges. The decision to proceed with legal action did not stem from emotion. It did not stem from bias. It stemmed from alignment or misalignment between narrative and verifiable facts. Investigators, legal counsel, and prosecutors examined each sequence carefully, evaluating whether the account could withstand scrutiny in a courtroom. It was at this stage that the first major pivot occurred. Certain gaps and inconsistencies, while previously minor, became significant when juxtaposed with corroborated evidence. Timing discrepancies, omissions, and reconstructed explanations highlighted areas where the account could not entirely reconcile with independent records. The investigators' approach had revealed the narrative's boundaries, and those boundaries were now legally consequential. Formal statements were documented and reviewed for accuracy. The subject was presented with the opportunity to verify or clarify each entry. This step ensured that procedural fairness was maintained and that every recorded statement could later be cross-referenced in legal proceedings. Arrest decisions were informed by these cumulative observations. They were based not on sudden revelation, but on careful, documented assessment. Every action taken was traceable, defensible, and aligned with established investigative standards. Once charges were filed, the case moved into the judicial phase. The interrogation records played a central role. Each statement, each behavioral observation, and each documented response was submitted as part of the evidentiary package. Legal counsel reviewed every detail to ensure procedural compliance, while prosecutors evaluated how these records might establish timelines, accountability, and corroboration. In court, the interrogation was not presented as a dramatic turning point, but as a factual record. Its value lay in structure, documentation, and observable behavior under scrutiny. The narrative she had maintained was analyzed, compared, and placed alongside independent evidence, allowing the court to assess both its reliability and its limitations. The consequences of this process were profound. For investigators, the interrogation validated the importance of structured, repeated questioning combined with independent documentation. It demonstrated how patience and precision can expose discrepancies without confrontation or spectacle. For the legal system, it provided a clear, verifiable record upon which decisions could be made. Every clarification, adjustment, and response became part of the framework used to assess credibility, sequence, and plausibility. For the public, the eventual reporting of events was informed by documentation rather than assumption. The story that had once seemed simple, the story of a parent caught in a tragic incident, was now understood in greater complexity. The public perception, once grounded in familiarity and expectation, was refined by evidence, chronology, and professional assessment. Ultimately, the outcome of the interrogation did not produce immediate, overt drama. It produced something subtler, yet more consequential: clarity. It exposed where a narrative could withstand scrutiny, where it could not, where explanation substituted for memory, where coherence required active effort. From this foundation, legal proceedings could proceed. Charges were filed. Evidence was submitted. Courtrooms were prepared to examine timelines, statements, and corroboration. Every subsequent step, the trial, testimonies, and final judgments, was informed by the meticulous process that began in that quiet room, hours earlier. In essence, the interrogation served its purpose not by forcing a confession, but by creating a record so complete that truth could be measured, assessed, and adjudicated. It is here, in this methodical process, that the case illustrates a fundamental principle of investigative work. Precision and patience, documentation and observation, can change the trajectory of an entire case. Even when outward appearances remain unchanged. Even when composure is maintained. Even when the narrative seems unbroken, the structure around it can reveal what words alone cannot. And in the legal system, it is that structure, the record, the timeline, the alignment with evidence, that ultimately determines consequence. Once the interrogation concluded and the case moved into the legal system, the public narrative began to shift. For weeks prior, the story had been understood through familiarity. A mother, a caregiver, a parent, a figure known to the community. A life largely documented through ordinary routines and quiet consistency. News outlets, social media commentary, and community discussions initially reflected this perception. Headlines emphasized tragedy rather than accountability. Friends and neighbors shared their impressions of attentiveness, care, and devotion. The incident in the public eye was framed as a misfortune, a sudden event that challenged the normal patterns of daily life. This framing began to change after formal charges were announced. Reporting shifted subtly at first. Journalists referenced the interrogation only indirectly, focusing on the procedural rigor of the investigation. They described timelines, evidence, and statements without commentary on character. The narrative transitioned from assumption to documentation. Community perception followed. People who had once relied on personal observation were confronted with documented timelines, objective evidence, and formal statements. The alignment or misalignment between previously held beliefs and recorded fact became the central topic of discussion. Social media amplified this shift. Accounts of the investigation, quoting neutral sources, were disseminated widely. Comparisons were drawn between what had been observed in public and what records now indicated. Discussion was often focused on understanding rather than judgment, though natural curiosity about incongruities emerged. At the trial, this reframing became concrete. Jurors were presented with documented evidence derived directly from the interrogation room. Statements, clarifications, behavioral observations, and independent records formed the core of the prosecution's narrative. Every deviation, every adjustment, every alignment between her account and corroborated evidence was analyzed systematically. The defense also engaged in this process. They emphasized context, cognitive load, and the normalcy of reconstructive memory under stress. They argued that composure, adjustment, and reasoning are not proof of intent, but reflections of human cognition in high-pressure situations. This exchange highlighted a critical tension: the difference between public perception and judicial interpretation. Outside the courtroom, the narrative had been simplified. Inside, it was examined in detail. Every pause, every clarification, every adaptation was scrutinized for meaning. Community members, while following reporting, had to reconcile long-held impressions with these findings. What was once interpreted as confidence and control became, in the light of documented evidence, an observable behavior under examination. What was once considered instinctive parenting now existed alongside precise timelines and repeated questioning. This reframing affected not only understanding of her actions, but the broader discussion of investigative process. The case became an example of how perception can differ from documented reality, and how evidence, observation, and structured questioning provide clarity that public observation cannot. Media coverage reflected this duality. Reports emphasized facts over emotion. They outlined sequences, statements, and evidence. They highlighted the role of interrogation in clarifying events, rather than portraying it as a dramatic confrontation. Even commentary from experts focused on process, cognitive interpretation, and the alignment of narrative with independent records. By the time the trial commenced, the public had been introduced to a more nuanced understanding. The narrative of Mother remained, but it was now layered with procedural observation, factual clarification, and documented behavior under scrutiny. This duality, public image and investigative reality, was central to the outcome of the case. It demonstrated how a carefully structured interrogation can bridge the gap between perception and evidence. It also illustrated how communities, when presented with detailed reporting and documentation, begin to reinterpret events that once seemed familiar. In the courtroom, this reframing reached its final stage. Evidence presented was no longer abstract. It was linked directly to statements, timelines, and corroboration. Jurors could observe the process by which investigators had documented adjustments, reconciled discrepancies, and tested narrative integrity. Each element of the interrogation, once confidential, now formed the backbone of legal assessment. Outside, the broader community followed the trial closely. They recognized that familiarity and reputation, while influential, were not determinative. They saw that procedural rigor and methodical evidence gathering could alter understanding, even when prior impressions suggested certainty. By the conclusion of the trial, the reframing was complete. The story had shifted from one defined by assumption and observation to one grounded in documentation, methodical investigation, and systematic interpretation. The interrogation, the long hours, the repeated questioning, the careful introduction of independent evidence, was central to that shift. It had changed not only the direction of the investigation, but the framework through which the public, the media, and the legal system understood what had occurred. It is in this convergence of procedure and perception that the full significance of the case emerges. Because in situations like this, clarity is not instantaneous. It is constructed, slowly, deliberately, through observation, documentation, and analysis. And only then can the story move from assumption to understanding. This case demonstrates the power of procedure. The interrogation, the structured review of records, the careful comparison of statements to evidence. All of these processes reveal truths that observation alone cannot provide. They show that what is seen in public may not reflect the full scope of events, and that reputation, familiarity, and assumption are fragile measures of understanding. For investigators, the lesson is clear. Patience, repetition, and methodical documentation are critical. Every statement, no matter how composed, must be tested against independent records. Every adjustment, no matter how subtle, must be logged and contextualized. For the legal system, the implications are equally significant. Evidence is strongest not when it shocks, but when it is clear, verifiable, and reproducible. The integrity of the process, its attention to sequence, timing, and documentation, ensures that outcomes rest on fact rather than perception. For the public, this case offers insight into human behavior under scrutiny. People maintain composure, reason through gaps, and reconcile memory with new information. This does not prove innocence or guilt, but it demonstrates how cognitive and behavioral responses can be observed, recorded, and interpreted systematically. Perhaps most importantly, the case underscores a principle that applies beyond the courtroom. Appearances can be deceiving, but methodical observation is not. Transparency, consistency, and rigorous documentation provide clarity where assumption might otherwise prevail. And in the broader context of society, the story highlights the role of ethical, victim-centered investigation. The goal is never to dramatize, but to uncover truth. The goal is never to vilify before evidence is established, but to allow evidence to shape understanding. Every record, every observation, every line of questioning is part of a system designed to achieve this clarity. And when that system functions as intended, the truth becomes visible, not as spectacle, but as structure. When the final verdict was delivered, the investigation had come full circle. What began as a single incident, observed superficially, had evolved into a meticulously documented account. Every detail, every pause, every adjustment in narrative had been recorded, compared, and interpreted. The public, the media, and the legal system had all witnessed a transformation, from assumption to evidence, from familiarity to structured understanding. And the lessons endure. In the quiet moments between questions, in the careful review of independent records, and in the observation of subtle behavioral shifts, the investigative process reveals not only facts, but principles, patience, precision, and ethical rigor. The story also reminds us of human complexity. People maintain appearances, adjust narratives under scrutiny, and reconcile gaps in memory with reasoning. Understanding this requires not judgment, but attention, method, and clarity. True crime, when approached responsibly, is not about shock or spectacle. It is about process. It is about learning from evidence, understanding human behavior, and respecting the consequences of every action. This case, in its entirety, illustrates that narrative is fragile. Reputation is not proof. And clarity, when it emerges, is a product of careful work, structured observation, and ethical commitment. For investigators, legal professionals, and the public alike, the ultimate lesson is that truth is built patiently, piece by piece, question by question, record by record. And in that careful construction, understanding replaces assumption, documentation replaces speculation, and justice, measured, methodical, and precise, becomes possible. Please don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. Comment, like, and share.